February 21st, 2018, a private jet touched down in Asheville, North Carolina, carrying the body of a man who had preached the gospel to more living people, face to face, than anyone else in human history. Not a president, not a pope, a farm boy from Charlotte named Billy Graham. For 60 years, he shook hands with every American president from Truman to Obama. He filled stadiums that no rock band could fill. 1.1 million people over 6 weeks in Seoul, South Korea in 1973, believed to be the largest live religious gathering ever assembled for one man's voice. He preached in person to more than 210 million people across 185 countries and territories. And when he finally closed his eyes for the last time at age 99, he left behind something almost nobody talks about, honestly. Not a small one, a canyon. Because here's the question nobody wants to answer directly. When the most trusted religious figure of the 20th century dies, who takes the microphone? Who becomes America's pastor now? And if you think the answer is simple, if you think there's some obvious next Billy Graham waiting in the wings, I need you to stick with me for the next 20 minutes, because the real answer is stranger, more fractured, and honestly more revealing about the state of faith in the modern world than almost anyone is willing to say out loud. Some people will tell you it's his son. Some people will tell you it's a megachurch pastor with an app on your phone right now. Some people will tell you the very question is outdated, a relic of a media era that no longer exists. By the end of this video, you'll understand why all three of those answers are true at the same time, and why that might be the most important religious story of our generation that almost nobody is covering. Before we talk about who could replace him, we have to understand what made Billy Graham unrepeatable in the first place. Because this isn't just a story about faith, it's a story about timing, technology, and a kind of cultural authority that may never exist again for any single individual, religious or otherwise. Billy Graham was born in 1918 outside Charlotte, North Carolina, the son of a dairy farmer. Nothing about his early life predicted global fame. He wasn't groomed for greatness. He was, by most accounts, an ordinary, energetic young man who found faith at a tent revival and eventually enrolled at Wheaton College, where he met his future wife, Ruth Bell, the daughter of missionaries in China. Turned Billy Graham into Billy Graham, the brand, the institution, the household name, wasn't just his preaching, although his preaching was extraordinary. It was his understanding, decades ahead of his peers, that mass media and mass evangelism could be fused together into something entirely new. In 1949, a young Graham held a tent revival in Los Angeles that was supposed to run 3 weeks. It ran 8. Newspaper mogul William Randolph Hearst reportedly sent a 2-word telegram to his editors: Puff Graham. Overnight, Graham went from a regional evangelist to a national sensation, covered by Time, Life, and every major paper in the country. There, he built something the world had never quite seen: an evangelistic operation with the production values of a Hollywood studio and the distribution reach of a television network. He founded the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, or BGEA, in 1950. He launched a radio program, Hour of Decision, that reached millions weekly. He moved into television specials that were appointment viewing for entire families. He launched Christianity Today, a magazine that reshaped American evangelicalism's intellectual identity. And he did all of it while maintaining something almost nobody in public religious life manages to keep for 6 decades, a reputation, largely, for personal integrity. He established what became known as the Modesto Manifesto in 1948, a set of self-imposed rules with his closest colleagues about financial transparency, sexual accountability, and avoiding the appearance of impropriety, specifically so that his ministry would never be brought down by the kind of scandal that had destroyed so many traveling evangelists before him. It worked. For 70 years, no major financial or moral scandal ever touched Billy Graham personally, which is almost unheard of in the history of American religious celebrity. And crucially, this is the part that matters most for our story, he became something bigger than an evangelist. He became a kind of unofficial national chaplain. He prayed with Eisenhower, he golfed with Nixon, and later distanced himself painfully from that relationship after Watergate. He counseled Clinton during impeachment. He stood beside George W. Bush at the National Cathedral after 9/11. Every single president, from Harry Truman to Barack Obama, either sought his counsel or crossed his path in some meaningful way. About what that actually means. In an era of Vietnam, Watergate, the Cold War, civil rights upheaval, the sexual revolution, and the rise of the religious right, one man managed to remain imperfectly but remarkably above the partisan fray as a trusted spiritual voice to nearly every administration for half a century. That is not a job description. That is closer to a historical accident that happened to one specific man in one specific media environment. which brings us to the uncomfortable truth at the center of this whole video. The most obvious place to look for a successor is the family, and on paper, the institutional handoff was actually remarkably smooth. Franklin Graham, Billy's eldest son, had a well-documented rebellious streak in his youth. Smoking, drinking, dating, generally living about as far from his father's public image as you could imagine for a preacher's kid. In his autobiography, Rebel with a Cause, Franklin explained his turning point bluntly, "Just being the son of Billy Graham won't get me into heaven." At age 22 in a hotel room in Jerusalem, he committed his life to Christ. From there, his path diverged from his father's in an important way. Rather than starting as a stadium evangelist, Franklin built his reputation through Samaritan's Purse, the international Christian relief organization he joined in the late 1970s and became president of in 1979, following the death of its founder, Bob Pierce. Under Franklin's leadership, Samaritan's Purse grew into one of the largest Christian humanitarian organizations in the world, delivering disaster relief, medical aid, and, most visibly, more than 244 million shoebox gifts through its Operation Christmas Child program to children in over 170 countries since 1993. Franklin was formally appointed CEO of the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association in 2000 and president in 2001, taking over full operational control while his father was still alive, which allowed for an unusually clean transition compared to most family-run religious empires, many of which implode in bitter succession fights the moment the founder dies. Today, Franklin Graham still leads both organizations, and he remains genuinely active, not a figurehead holding a title while other people do the work. In just the past couple of years, he preached to more than 430,000 people at a single festival in Ethiopia, held events in London, Belgium, and Buenos Aires, and continued his God Loves You tour through the UK, including a stop planned for Manchester's Co-op Live Arena. He's preached at more than 275 evangelistic events across roughly 50 U.S. states and territories, and more than 50 countries since 1989. He also serves as editor-in-chief of BGEA's Decision magazine and oversees a 24-hour prayer line that has reportedly logged over 4.5 million calls. So, by pure output, Franklin Graham is arguably the most direct operational successor to his father's evangelistic machine. But here's where it gets complicated, and this is a distinction you need to understand if you want to actually grasp this topic instead of just getting a surface-level answer. Franklin Graham is not Billy Graham in the eyes of the broader American public, and the reason isn't about work ethic or sincerity of faith. It's about posture. Billy Graham spent enormous energy trying to appear nonpartisan, a pastor to both sides of the aisle, even when he privately leaned toward certain politicians. Franklin Graham has taken a dramatically more overtly political approach, becoming an outspoken and consistent voice in conservative political circles, appearing at conservative political conferences, and weighing in directly and repeatedly on hot-button political issues in a way his father generally tried to avoid, at least publicly, especially in his later years after the bruises of the Nixon era. That single difference in approach, political entanglement versus perceived neutrality, is arguably the single biggest reason why, despite leading a larger and more far-reaching organization in some respects than his father ever did, Franklin Graham does not occupy the same nation's pastor cultural space Billy Graham once held. He's massively influential within evangelical and conservative Christian circles. He is not a unifying figure across the broader, more religiously and politically diverse American public, the way his father at his peak managed to be. If Franklin represents the operational continuation of the ministry, his son, Billy Graham's grandson, represents something else, the attempt to keep the traditional stadium crusade model alive for a new generation of audiences. Will Graham, formerly William Franklin Graham IV, serves as executive vice president and vice chairman of the board of BGEA. He and his father now regularly travel and preach together, dividing up an increasingly packed international calendar of what BGEA calls celebrations and festivals, essentially modernized crusades that combine contemporary Christian music acts with evangelistic preaching. In just the recent past, Will Graham has led events from Uijeongbu, South Korea, to Gulfport, Biloxi, Mississippi, drawing thousands of attendees at each stop, often featuring well-known Christian recording artists as the draw before he takes the stage to preach. BGEA's stated strategy for years like this, one has explicitly centered Will Graham as a continuing generational torchbearer, extending what is now a third-generation family evangelistic dynasty, something almost unheard of in American religious history at this scale. The symbolic value here is enormous, even if the cultural reach is smaller than his grandfather's peak. Will Graham represents continuity. He represents the idea that the Graham name and the Graham method, big venue, big music, direct gospel appeal, and invitation to come forward, isn't dying with the man who invented it. He is, by any honest measure, operating in a far more crowded and fragmented media and cultural environment than his grandfather ever faced, which naturally caps how large a cultural footprint any single figure, however talented, can realistically achieve today. That, more than any individual shortcoming, is the real story here. Now let's step outside the family, because the family isn't the whole story. Several major figures in American and global Christianity have, in different and very specific ways, absorbed pieces of the space Billy Graham once occupied almost entirely alone. Rick Warren. If there's one person outside the Graham bloodline who was most directly mentored and publicly blessed by Billy Graham himself, it's Rick Warren. Warren founded Saddleback Church in Lake Forest, California in 1980, starting with just over 200 people on Easter Sunday, and grew it into one of the largest churches in the country. His book, The Purpose-Driven Life, became one of the best-selling nonfiction books in American publishing history, translated into dozens of languages and read by tens of millions of people worldwide. Warren, for a stretch of the 2000s and 2010s, genuinely functioned as something close to a modern-day Billy Graham figure, a preacher capable of speaking to presidents from both parties. He delivered the invocation at Barack Obama's first inauguration, a moment that drew criticism from progressives over his views on social issues, and criticism from conservatives simply for participating in an Obama event at all, which, ironically, is almost exactly the kind of bridge-building tightrope Billy Graham himself walked for decades. Warren's story also illustrates exactly why a clean, lasting successor role is so hard to sustain in the modern religious landscape. In 2021, Warren ordained 3 women as pastors at Saddleback, a decision that directly conflicted with the Southern Baptist Convention's official position. He announced his retirement shortly afterward, citing health issues, including a diagnosis of spinal myoclonus, a neurological condition causing tremors and blurred vision. He formally stepped down in September 2022, handing leadership to Andy and Stacy Wood, a husband and wife pastoral team he selected after interviewing roughly 100 potential candidates. In February 2023, the Southern Baptist Convention voted to formally oust Saddleback Church from the denomination specifically over the issue of women serving as pastors. Think about that for a second. The church founded by the man Billy Graham personally mentored, the church that produced one of the best-selling religious books in modern history, was expelled from its own denomination within roughly a year of Warren's departure. That's not a knock on Warren or on Saddleback. It's a demonstration of exactly the fragmentation this video keeps coming back to. Even the most successful, most broadly respected evangelical institutions of the post-Graham era are now navigating theological and cultural divides around gender, around politics, around denominational identity that simply didn't split audiences the same way during Graham's prime. Craig Groeschel. If Rick Warren represents Graham's mentee, Craig Groeschel represents Graham's method reborn for the internet age. Groeschel founded Life Church in Edmond, Oklahoma in 1996 and built it into one of the largest multi-site churches in America, pioneering the church campus model that broadcasts a single sermon simultaneously to dozens of physical locations. Groeschel's real claim to Graham-level global reach isn't the church itself. It's what his team built alongside it, the YouVersion Bible app. YouVersion has been downloaded by hundreds of millions of people across virtually every country on earth, making it arguably one of the most widely used pieces of specifically Christian technology ever created. In a very real sense, Groeschel didn't try to fill stadiums the way Graham did. He built a stadium that fits in everyone's pocket. That's the digital native answer to who replaced Billy Graham's reach. It's not a preacher standing behind a podium broadcasting on 3 television networks. It's an app quietly sitting on hundreds of millions of home screens, delivering scripture and devotionals directly, continuously, without needing a single mass gathering at all. Greg Laurie. If you're looking for the person who most literally recreated the Billy Graham Crusade experience, stadium, altar call, contemporary music, mass attendance, that's Greg Laurie. Laurie founded Harvest Christian Fellowship in Riverside, California, and has led the Harvest Crusade events since 1990, filling stadiums like Angels Stadium and Dodger Stadium with tens of thousands of attendees across multi-night events, drawing millions of total attendees over the decades. Laurie has been open about the direct influence Billy Graham had on his ministry model, and in operational terms, he's probably the closest living approximation of the classic Graham Crusade format still functioning at scale in America today. And this is a pattern you should be noticing by now. Laurie's reach, while genuinely massive within American evangelicalism, doesn't extend into the broader cultural and political mainstream the way Graham's did. Laurie is enormously respected inside the church world. He is not, and doesn't try to be, a figure that secular news anchors reference the way they once referenced Billy Graham as a kind of default national religious voice. Now let's zoom all the way out, because this is really the heart of the video, and it's the part almost nobody explains clearly. The reason nobody has replaced Billy Graham isn't a talent gap. There are gifted, sincere, hardworking preachers all over the world today. The reason is structural, and it comes down to three massive shifts that happened after Graham built his ministry. First, media fragmentation. When Billy Graham was at his peak, American households had access to three major television networks. If Graham's crusade aired, a meaningful share of the entire television-watching population in the country had a real chance of stumbling onto it or tuning in deliberately. There was a shared cultural attention span that simply does not exist anymore. Today, attention is split across hundreds of streaming platforms, thousands of YouTube channels, an endless scroll of social media algorithms that serve every single person a different personalized reality. There is no single broadcast moment powerful enough to reach the percentage of the population Graham could reach with one television special in 1957. It's not that today's preachers are less capable. It's that the shared stage they need to stand on to reach a Graham-sized audience has been broken into a million smaller stages. And second, the rise of the global South. Here's a shift that gets far too little attention in Western coverage of this topic. Billy Graham himself was actually deeply aware of this coming shift and tried to prepare for it. He helped launch the Lausanne movement in 1974, an ongoing global effort to coordinate and expand evangelism, specifically outside the traditional Western church centers. And that effort succeeded beyond what many expected, just not in a way that produces a single Western celebrity face. The center of gravity for global Christianity has genuinely shifted to Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Countries like Nigeria, Brazil, South Korea, and the Philippines now host some of the largest and fastest growing Christian populations and church movements on earth. The next generation of globally significant Christian leaders is increasingly emerging from those regions, not from Charlotte, North Carolina, or Southern California. Because Western media infrastructure, the news networks, the major publishing houses, the English-language press still largely centers Western figures, most American audiences have almost no visibility into who these emerging global leaders even are. The next Billy Graham, in terms of raw global spiritual influence, may already be preaching to enormous, rapidly growing congregations in Lagos, or Seoul, or Sao Paulo right now, and most people watching this video have never heard their name. That's not a failure of those leaders. That's a failure of Western media attention. Third, political polarization. This might be the single biggest structural barrier of all. Billy Graham built enormous trust, specifically because he functioned, imperfectly but genuinely, as a spiritual figure who could sit across from a Republican president one year and a Democratic president the next, and be received, at least outwardly, as a pastor rather than a partisan operative. That kind of positioning is almost unthinkable for a major religious figure to sustain today. American culture, and especially American religious culture, has become so politically sorted that almost any major evangelical figure who takes a stand on any hot-button issue, immigration, sexuality, gender, abortion, elections, instantly becomes coded as belonging to one political tribe or the other, in the eyes of a huge chunk of the public. Franklin Graham's explicit political alignment is one clear example. Rick Warren's ordination of women pastors, and the subsequent denominational fallout, is another from the opposite direction. There simply isn't the same cultural space anymore for a figure to be embraced as a trusted spiritual voice by people across the entire political spectrum. The room Billy Graham once stood in the middle of has effectively been split into two separate rooms. And very few religious leaders even attempt to stand in both at once anymore, because doing so now invites suspicion and criticism from both sides, rather than earning respect from both. So if it's not one man, what actually replaced Billy Graham? The honest answer is a network, a distributed, fragmented, genuinely global web of influence that includes his son running festivals on 5 continents, his grandson carrying the family name into a 3rd generation, a mentee who built one of the best-selling religious books of all time before running into the very polarization we just described, a tech-forward pastor whose Bible app quietly reaches more individual people daily than Graham's crusades ever did in aggregate, a stadium evangelist keeping the classic format alive in America, and an entire emerging generation of Global South leaders who are largely invisible to Western audiences, but who may ultimately shape the future of global Christianity more than anyone on this list. None of them, individually, occupies the cultural space Billy Graham occupied. All of them, together, roughly approximate the functions he served, Evangelism, media reach, political access, moral authority, humanitarian relief, just spread across many hands instead of concentrated in one. And honestly, there's a reasonable argument that this might be a healthier long-term outcome for the global church than concentrating that kind of singular trust and platform in one human being ever again. Concentrated religious celebrity has a well-documented failure rate, and spreading influence across institutions, families, technologies, and, crucially, across cultures and continents might make the whole system more resilient, even if it means we'll likely never again see a single name that an entire, politically divided nation can agree to trust the same way it once trusted Billy Graham. So here's where I'll leave it with you. Billy Graham wasn't just a preacher. He was a product of a very specific, very unrepeatable moment. A moment of centralized media, a still forming religious landscape in America, and a country not yet as politically fractured as it is today. His son inherited the machine, but not quite the myth. His grandson is trying to carry the torch into a new generation. A handful of outside leaders picked up different pieces of the mission. The mentee, the technologist, the crusade preacher, and an entire generation of leaders most of us have never heard of is quietly building the actual future of global Christianity, somewhere far outside the American spotlight. There is no next Billy Graham. There's something more complicated, more scattered, and in its own way, more honest about where faith and culture actually stand today. If this kind of deep dive into religion, culture, and the people who shape it is something you want more of, make sure you're subscribed, because we're just getting started. Drop a comment and tell me, who do you think comes closest to filling that role today? I read every single one, and I'll be responding to the best ones in the next video. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.